Carolina, Mr. Butterfield, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for yielding time this morning. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to commemorate the life and work of our dear friend and colleague, Congressman John Robert Lewis. I appreciate the words of Congressman Al Green just a moment ago, and I want to associate myself with his remarks. Mr. Speaker, John Lewis came to this body in 1987. He came with scars from a turbulent period of American history. It was John Lewis who led the voting rights movement in the South. We refer to it as the Selma to Montgomery March. Some refer to it as Bloody Sunday. Many Americans don't realize that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not include a provision for voting. Voting was left out of that legislation, and because of that, the African American community was determined to get voting rights. After Dr. King received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, he visited the White House to have a conversation with President Lyndon Johnson. He asked Lyndon Johnson for a Voting Rights Act. It was there that President Johnson challenged Dr. King to go back to the South and to demand a Voting Rights Act. And because of that, the Voting Rights Act, the voting rights movement began in Selma, Alabama. And it was John Lewis who led that movement. Leaving Brown Chapel Church leaving Brown Chapel Church on March 7th of 1965, John Lewis led the Selma to Montgomery March, demanding a Voting Rights Act and the right to vote. At the apex of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, John Lewis and the other foot soldiers encountered 150 state troopers and a mob waiting for them. John Lewis instructed the marchers to get on their knees and pray. They were beaten, and they were beaten severely. They returned to Brown Chapel Church, and 3 weeks later returned for the continuation of their march. By the time they got to Montgomery, there were 50,000 people in the march. Because of this movement, Mr. Speaker, President Lyndon Johnson led an extraordinary effort to pass the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which protects the right to vote. The VRA has enabled millions of African Americans to register, which has enabled many of the Congressional Black Caucus to be elected and reelected. And I might say that today is the 16th anniversary of my election to Congress in a special election. I had the privilege of talking with Congressman Lewis nearly every legislative day for the past 15 years. We spent countless hours on this floor, seated to my left, talking about his upbringing in Troy, Alabama, how African Americans seeking the right to vote had to count marbles on a jar and bubbles in a bar of soap. We talked about his first meeting of Martin Luther King Jr. and how Dr. King would lovingly refer to him as John Robert. As we would walk across the Capitol Plaza and walk through airports, both in this country and other countries, never did he fail to stop and to greet other people and to take very quick pictures. His courtesy to our Capitol staff was unmatched, and they will tell you so. And John Lewis served in this body with courage and conviction. It's often said that the Black Caucus is the conscience of the Congress. Well, John Lewis was also the conscience of the Congress. I recall, Mr. Speaker, the contentious ACA debate, the Affordable Care Act debate in 2010. As we left the Capitol that day, there was a confrontational gathering of the Tea Party on the steps of the Capitol. We were advised by the Capitol Police and even by our staffs to return to our offices through the tunnel. It was Congressman Lewis and Congressman Cleaver and Congressman Carson and myself who defied the Capitol Police, and we walked through that mob back to our offices. I remember that so well. We would fuss from time to time, Mr. Speaker, and I think you may have overheard some of our conversations from time to time. We would fuss with John Lewis about his grueling schedule, his travels to the West Coast on the weekends and back here to Washington on Monday. He would tell us about how he would get to his home here in Washington and fall asleep on the couch with his shoes on and wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning. When we would suggest that he might consider retirement, he would tell us, "I've got to keep going. I want to see the African American Museum. I want to see the update of the Voting Rights Act. I want to see the end of police misconduct." Finally, Mr. Speaker, at the invitation of President Obama, Congresswoman Terry Sewell, Congressman John Lewis, and me were invited to the White House for a viewing of the movie Selma. After viewing the movie, the president invited us, along with Oprah Winfrey and the cast of the movie, to the Oval Office for a very delightful visit. While there, President Obama said, "John, do you remember you gave me a magazine with your picture when I was first elected to the Senate? Well, let me show you." And he took us into a hallway off from the Oval Office, and there hung the magazine with John Lewis's picture on it. John Robert Lewis, Mr. Speaker, now belongs to the ages. John Robert Lewis now belongs to the ages. He helped make this world a better place. John would say to us today, the struggle continues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.